And again, as I mentioned in the email this morning, we're going to be talking about just a brief survey of the life of the Apostle Paul. There is so much that we could cover, but we do have to limit it to uh, time restraints this evening. There are so many parts of his life that could be sermons all by themselves, and I'm sure that I'll mention some of those areas and some of those aspects of his life as we get to them. So let's begin with the Apostle Paul. Some of this is conjecture because there obviously is not a history book that says he was born in 2 AD or 5 AD, but it is believed people who have done the calculation from the book of Acts and have gone into whatever historical records there are. It's believed that he was a little bit younger than Jesus Christ, that he was born sometime between 1 and 5 AD. And of course, his original name was Saul, named after King Saul of the Old Testament. He was descended himself from the tribe of Benjamin. That was his descent, but he was Hellenistic. He was born in the city of Tarsus, located in Asia Minor, and that's mentioned in Acts chapter 21, verses 39. Tarsus was the capital of a Roman province, the province of Cilicia, and it was a wealthy trading city. So he lived and grew up as a young boy in a Jewish community or little Jewish pocket within this Gentile city. So he rubbed elbows with Gentiles. You can see how God is preparing him for his ministry. He doesn't look at Gentiles as creepy. He grows up in a Gentile city. He talks to Gentiles. He sees them walking on the streets. So when the time comes for God to call him, it's a lot easier for him to spend time teaching the gospel to the Gentiles than it might be from some others who lived rather restricted lives in the Jewish communities of Jerusalem and really didn't understand the Gentile mindset very well. So again, he's born in Tarsus. This city was the leading center of Greek learning. So he spoke a lot of languages, highly educated. We would say he was a very smart man, is the term that we would use today. In Roman times, it was a pretty good sized town. It had a population of about 500,000 people, and that was actually quite impressive during that time for a city to have a population of that size. So here we're going to take a look at Tarsus. As you look at the right hand, I put a little yellow arrow down there that just gives you an idea. There again in Asia Minor, what you see in white here are what we might call counties. So Tarsus was within Cilicia, which again, using a modern phraseology, it'd be like saying, the city of Litchfield is in Medina County. Tarsus was where he grew up. It was an ideal environment for his education, where Western culture and learning blended with the thought and religion of the East. So there's a lot that he could learn there. He was being prepared many, many years later to be able to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. He understood Gentiles, he knew how they thought, he knew how they were educated, and he could relate to them on a level that would have been very difficult for a Peter or for someone else again who just grew up in the Jewish community of Jerusalem and never had that much contact with Gentiles, or maybe through negativity had racist or bigoted attitude towards Gentiles. So Paul would have this advantage because this is where he was born. And as a young man, this is where he grew up. Even though as a teenager, he did go to Jerusalem for religious training. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. So Paul spoke Koine Greek. That was the Greek of the common person, not the highly educated, not written Greek from the scholastic world. He spoke Koine Greek and he understood Hebrew and Aramaic and perhaps Latin. So, again, this emphasizes just what a good education he had. He was familiar with Greek literature. His writings present a man with an excellent formal education, and every scholar who reads his books and his writings say that just the way he structures sentences and the way he uses Greek shows that he's a master of the Greek language and understands it quite well. We don't know much about how Paul may have looked. Here's the only thing we really have. This is an apocryphal writing called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And in that, this was written, by the way, about 180 AD, so over 100 years after Paul had died. So take it for what it's worth, but this is what it says. This book was not accepted as part of the New Testament, but it describes what the Apostle Paul looked like. And I guess we could say it's still pretty close to his life. If it's only 100 years after he died, it may have been left over from an oral tradition or other writings about Paul. But here's what it says about him. It says he was bald headed, bow-legged, strongly built, a man small in size, with meeting eyebrows. So he had a unibrow, as we would say in our modern age, with a rather large nose, full of grace, and at times he looked like a man, and at times he had the face of an angel. End of quote. And that quotation was taken from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. So that's about the only thing we have historically that would give us any kind of an idea of what the Apostle Paul may have looked like. We'll take a look at some of these scriptures. I'll just go through this slide here and then we'll actually look at some of these scriptures. Paul was able to claim Roman citizenship. He was a Roman citizen because his father had acquired Roman citizenship. It passed on to him. And here's what I want to emphasize again that I did a few minutes ago. This was an advantage for Paul. If you took someone like Peter or someone who wasn't a Roman citizen and you just put them out into the Gentile world to travel and preach the gospel, they would be extremely vulnerable because they virtually have no rights. They would be a stranger in every city that they went into, and they would absolutely positively have no rights, could easily be abused. When you were a Roman citizen, you at least had some rights. Now, that doesn't mean you could commit treason. That doesn't mean you could be a troublemaker or incite a riot, which Paul was accused of a number of times. But being a Roman citizen gave you a little bit protection in these cities as you went into them. And this was something that Paul had that the other disciples did not have. Paul was raised from a small child to be an observant Jew. And like any Jewish son, he learned a trade. He happened to be a tent maker, and we'll read about that and proof that he worked with his hands. In his early teens, he was sent to Jerusalem to learn advanced religious training from a man named Gamaliel, and we'll explain who he was, a very prominent rabbi at the time. So now that we've gone through some of those bullet points, let's take a look at a few scriptures to understand these points more powerfully. In Acts chapter 22, Paul is accused, as this all started out, he was accused of bringing a Gentile in the temple, which he had not. And a big uproar occurred. The Romans seized him. They were taking him back to their barracks to interrogate him. And the idea came upon, let's scourge this man and question him and find out who he is and what he's doing. And Paul, knowing his rights as a Roman citizen, said probably verse 25 or 26. I didn't have the room to put it on this slide, but he said, is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman citizen? And of course it wasn't. And the man knew that. And that's when we picked this up. Then the commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? Now, he doesn't mean ethnically a Roman. He means, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, this is Paul, yes. And then in verse 28, the commander answered, with a large sum I obtained the citizenship. And Paul said, but I was born a citizen. And that is because it was carried over from his father, obviously being a Roman citizen. So Paul was a Roman citizen. Again, this was a gateway that opened doors for him to do things in the Gentile world and give him at least a certain degree of protection and some legal rights. All right, Acts chapter 18, verses 2 and 3. This talks about his trade. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So he met them, and here he begins working with them. And so, because he was one of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. For by occupation, they were tent makers. So Paul worked with his hands. We have to realize we're talking a long time ago. There was no way that checks could be sent to you to finance your expenses, to finance building churches. Paul is a missionary. There are no ATM machines that he can borrow and pull out a couple grand to get through the week. He's on his own. So, and sometimes he would go in congregations like Corinth, and they wouldn't even support him financially. Some congregations did support him, other congregations did not support him. So, how was he to be supported? Well, he would ask and he would try to stay with people, but he was not above working with his hands while he was also in the ministry, using his occupation as a tent maker in a positive way in order to earn some income. So it was common for Paul to do that. Let's get back now to the influence of Gamaliel on Paul. Gamaliel was a highly respected rabbi and a teacher. Again, this is Acts chapter 22. He's been drug out of the temple by an angry mob. He's arrested by Romans and led towards the barracks for protection. And almost on the steps of the barracks, he engages a conversation with the people in the crowd again. And here's what he says: Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. And when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, again, he was multilingual, they kept all the more silent. Then he said, I am indeed a Jew, born of Tarsus, of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. And that would have been impressive because Gamaliel was a highly respected Pharisee. So he was like the Socrates of the Jewish community, deeply respected. So he says, I was brought up in this city, meaning as a teenager, he had been sent to Jerusalem by his father for education, brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous towards God as you are today. So he says, I was very similar to the strictness of the law, just like many of you are at this point in your life. So who was this Gamaliel guy? Well, we'll read what it says about him from the Holman Bible Dictionary. He was, and I'm again, this is a quote, a highly regarded Pharisee who was a member of the Sanhedrin. Remember, the Sanhedrin was basically the council of the Jewish leaders who made many of the religious decisions. They were allowed to exist because the Romans found it useful, and the Romans tried to avoid getting involved in Jewish religious matters as much as they could because they found it all very distasteful, and they left it in the hands of those kinds of things, in the hands of the Sanhedrin, of which Gamaliel was a member. Continuing here, he squelched a plan by the Sanhedrin to kill the apostles by reminding the members that interference with what the apostles were doing might prove to be opposition to God. If the work of the apostles were purely a human work, Gamaliel said, it would come to nothing anyway. So he advised them, just leave these people alone. If it's of God, then you're resisting God if you persecute them. If they're not of God, they're just going to die out anyway, and they won't even exist in a short period of time. According to Acts chapter 22:3, this Gamaliel had been Paul's teacher. He was the grandson of the great Rabbi Hillel. Again, if you're into Jewish history and you've read about the great Jewish rabbis who had tremendous influence in Judaism, one of them was Rabbi Hillel, and Gamaliel died about 52 AD. So that at least gives us a little bit of background who this man was who was a teacher. Notice he was a Pharisee, and before Paul was called, he was a Pharisee. So Paul was, in essence, taught to be a Pharisee, to think like a Pharisee, and to be very zealous for the law. So let's take a look at a few other points about Paul as we survey his life. Galatians chapter 1, verse 13, we won't go there tonight, but Paul, as he said himself, became a very strict Pharisee, so more strict than most Pharisees. He was very zealous, very dedicated. Paul persecuted the church because he rejected Jesus Christ as the Messiah and he rejected the gospel message. And that's mentioned in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Well, about 35 AD, something happens to Paul. He was converted while traveling to Damascus to persecute the believers. And we'll read about those events in Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 15. And this would be a major pivot in Paul's life when he would be converted from, of all things, a strict Pharisee to a Christian believer. And then what happens to Paul? I think it's very important that we understand this. For about the next 10 years, from about 35 to 45 AD, Paul is a minor figure in the church. A lot of people just assume that Paul is converted and suddenly he's recognized instantaneously as a great master evangelist and he begins all of these missionary journeys. No, about 10 years go by before he rises to the point where he's recognized in the church as a significant preacher. A lot of people would not have trusted him. We'll see, Ananias himself, when in a vision, when God tells him to go and lay his hands on the Apostle Paul, he himself says, "This man's trouble." He says what we would use in modern phraseology. This man Paul is not a very good human being. So a lot of people, it took a long time for them to build their trust in Paul, obviously concerned that he might have been a spy, that he might have been a traitor, that he might have been there to write down names and find out who the leaders were by pretending to be part of the movement. So for about 10 years, he's actually a minor figure in the Church of God. Let's take a look at a few of the scriptures now that tie into that slide, what we had looked at. First one is Galatians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Paul says, "For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the tradition of my fathers." So Paul says, I wasn't just a Pharisee, I was a zealous, a good Pharisee, and I was recognized as someone. And within the Judaism, I advanced within Judaism and was recognized as someone who was exceedingly zealous for the faith of Judaism, for the tradition and the Torah and the law and all of the things that the Pharisees focused on. So that's Paul making that comment in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 13. And then in Acts chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, it says this about him: "And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lament over him." He obviously was stoned to death and died. And I'm sure that shocked many of the members of the church who didn't think that would happen, maybe didn't believe that God would allow that to happen, but God did allow that to happen for his own reasons. And then in verse 3, "As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house, dragging off men and women, committing them to prison." When my wife and I went to the feast in Rome a few years back, we saw what some prisons look like, including one that Paul was in. These were not Trump resorts. I mean, these were foul, filthy places. I had to make sure that I didn't say something I didn't want to. These were foul, filthy places. These were holes. They smelled bad. There was no light coming into these. These were terrible places to be put into. And here these people, just because of their faith, are being torn away from their families, torn away from their children, breaking up families. This is what Paul or Saul was responsible for, dragging off men and women and committing them to prison. And the Roman authorities gave the rabbis the ability to give that kind of authority to heretics, whom they considered to be heretics to Judaism. So as we can see, Paul indeed caused a lot of trouble within the Church of God. But then it comes back again about 35 AD. Let's see what happens. Let's read about this miraculous event that occurs to the Apostle Paul as he's heading towards the city of Damascus, written in Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 7. As he journeyed and came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice. So this huge bright light, suddenly we would call it a floodlight, comes down, shines all around him, blinds him. He can't even really see anything except this light. And then he hears a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now that's a term that would be made when you're corralling animals. What you would do is if you wanted animals within a confined space to go in a certain direction, you would use something if you were a farmer or husbandman or whatever the term would be, you would use a long stick with a pointed end. Sometimes that pointed end of the goad actually had a metal piece on it. And what you would do is you would jab the animal, oftentimes in the the rear end, use a modern term, in order to get that animal to move. And what the animals usually would do is they would kick against the goads. Yeah, they'd be prodded and they'd be moving, but their legs would come up and they would try to kick the goad. That was a common thing that would occur at the time. But what happens when you kick the goad? Well, you poke yourself because the goad happens to be very sharp. And so Jesus is saying, why do you continue to hit your head against the wall? Why do you continue to hurt yourself, Paul, by resisting the truth? Verse 6. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? Then the Lord said to him, Arise and go into the city, and that's Damascus, and you will be told what you must do. And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless. They saw this bright light, they heard this voice, and they were as stunned as Paul was, because this obviously was a miracle. So they stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no one. Picking it up here now in verse 8. Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, remember that bright light, you naturally would close your eyes when you were just surrounded by light. And it might have been so intense, his eyes may have even hurt, and might have been the reason they were closed. But he opened his eyes and he saw no one. So in essence, he is blind. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and he was 3 days without sight. That's a long time to think. And that's what those 3 days are about. Neither ate nor drank. So this is a total, complete fast for 3 days. Now, we do the Day of Atonement and we're struggling. Imagine doing it for 3 entire days blind. Gave him a lot of time to think about his life, think about his purpose, think about what he had experienced on the road to Damascus. And that's exactly what God wanted to happen, because God wanted to convert him. Verse 10. Now there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him the Lord said, so the Lord comes to him in a vision, Ananias. And he said, Here I am, Lord. So the Lord said to him, Arise, and I want you to go to the street called Straight and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Paul of Tarsus, for behold, he is praying. So this is the end of the 3 days of fasting for Saul. He's obviously praying. He's looking for direction in his life. He's looking for God to make a connection with him. And this angel who's speaking to Ananias continues here in verse 12. And in a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias, that's you, coming in and putting his hand on him so he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. And Ananias is exactly right. That was what Saul did. That was Saul's reputation. And again, this is part of the reason that you won't hear a whole lot about Saul becoming Paul for the first 10 years of his ministry, because it takes some time to build trust and confidence. And there's a lot about Christianity that Saul needs to learn, obviously, at the same time. Picking it up now in verse 15, Ananias says that he is not a good human being, Lord. I've heard some really terrible things about the way he treats your people. But verse 15, but the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles. And I want you to notice this first, kings and the children of Israel. So he would preach to all three of these types in his ministry. But the key, the primary aspect of his ministry would be to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time now talking about Paul's missionary journeys. He had three missionary journeys that are recorded in the book of Acts, and we only have time to talk about them briefly. Each one of these missionary journeys could be a sermon in itself. All the cities that he visits and all the things that are said and done are just rich in history, rich in theology, and of course that they're recorded in the book of Acts with a few supporting passages from other things that he writes, like Galatians and a few other books that he writes in which he recalls some of this history. But he had three missionary journeys. His first missionary journey, which occurs between 46 and 48 AD, began at Antioch. And during this time, what led up to this is it isn't Paul that becomes a prominent leader, it's Barnabas who has become a prominent leader. As a matter of fact, if you look at a few scriptures, for example, in Acts chapter 11, verse 30, it says Barnabas and Saul. It doesn't say Saul and Barnabas. It says Barnabas and Saul. Barnabas gets first mentioned here in Acts chapter 12, verse 25. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry. So at first, it's Barnabas who is the key organizer and the leader of this first missionary journey. As I said a few times already tonight, it takes Paul a while before he gains the respect and the reputation within the church of God. And then in time, it becomes Saul and Silas, or Paul and Silas. And Paul gets first billing later on in these missionary journeys. So here's just a quick map. Now, this isn't a large number of cities like it happens to be on his, he goes all out at his second or third missionary journeys. This is just rather simple, and I'll kind of follow it a little bit with my mouse. So he leaves Antioch, he goes down to Salamis on Cyprus, goes over to Paphos, crosses the sea, goes up to Perga, then goes up to Antioch. From Antioch goes to Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, then returns, backtracks to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. Then he travels a different way to get back to the Mediterranean Sea, Italia. And then in this, Pamphylia would be, again, it would be the province, or what we would call the county. So Perga and Antilia would be part of uh, Perga, and Italia would be part of Pamphylia, which is the province, or what we would call a county. And it said here, if you see the yellow arrow, that young John Mark on this first missionary journey leaves suddenly and goes back to Jerusalem. We don't know why. Maybe he was young and immature. Maybe he just got sick physically and couldn't take it anymore. But for some reason, he leaves uh, Barnabas and Saul, and John Mark heads back to Jerusalem before this missionary journey is over. Meanwhile, Barnabas and Saul, they're at Atalia, and then they come across the Mediterranean Sea from west to east, and they eventually come back to the area of Antioch. So this is Paul's first journey, just a little brief outline of the kind of travels that they did. So that's the first missionary journey. The second missionary journey is far more complex. I won't be able or have the time to go through all the cities they stop at. This occurred between 49 and 52 AD. They departed from Antioch, which seemed to be a common place that would be a departure point. Might have been a nice number of Christians who were there, perhaps some who owned their homes and were able to be good hosts on some of these traveling journeys. So he departed from Antioch, this time not with Barnabas, but with Silas as his associate. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So by this time, when we're into Acts chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas had a conflict together. Yes, sometimes ministers have conflicts and they don't agree with each other. Sometimes they part ways. And that's exactly what happened with Paul and Barnabas. By this time, Paul is now a prominent leader of the church. So this 10-year period of time, now we're about 49 AD, Paul has risen to a very prominent, trusted position in the church. He's influential in the ministerial conference of 49 AD. And let's see here if we want to read, I guess will read a scripture that describes the conflict between Paul and Barnabas before we look at the map of the second missionary journey. So here it is. This is in Acts chapter 15 and verse 36. So after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, now let's go back and visit our brethren. So let's have another missionary journey. Let's go back and see those people that we initially preached the gospel to and founded some congregations. Let's do it again, and where we have preached the word of the Lord, and let's see how they're doing. Now, Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark. Remember the first journey, John Mark bolted or bailed out after the missionary journey got started and didn't finish with them. But Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia. That was the regional name of where John Mark departed, and had not gone with them to, quote, the work. In other words, he didn't finish the job, was Paul's opinion. And what Paul was saying, I don't want to take him. He's a quitter. He didn't finish his job. Verse 39, then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. And yes, sometimes in ministers and churches, contentions can become pretty sharp. Goes all the way back to Acts chapter 15. It unfortunately is a common theme in church history. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas. Notice Paul's getting first billing here before Silas, and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. I want to bring out one thing about growth and Christian maturity, something that Paul himself, a lesson that Paul would have learned. And it's a good lesson for us not to treat people too harshly, not to judge them too strongly, not to turn against people. Indeed, well, I think it's fair to say that what John called Mark did probably was not a really good thing. He left a really bitter taste in Paul's mouth, and Paul didn't trust him at all. And here's what Paul said. Let's read this again. But Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. So that wasn't the best moment for John Mark. Now let's fast forward about 17 years later. after that event in Acts chapter 15. Here's what Paul writes to Timothy. He says, "Be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world." Paul is hurt because the people that he needed company with, the people who should have encouraged him, the people who should have been visiting him, were all forsaking him, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. And here he says something that's very powerful. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. This is the same Mark, previously called John Mark, exact same individual whom Paul lost faith and confidence in 17 years earlier. He's proven himself to be a very loyal and faithful Christian, and someone whom Paul obviously grew to love in spite of the things that happened on their missionary journey. So he says, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry." Again, I think that's a good lesson for all of us, and that is to offer forgiveness, to not hold grudges against people, not to judge people too harshly, give them space to grow, give people an opportunity to change and become better than they are. And that's exactly a lesson that Paul himself learned regarding this man. Okay, Paul's second journey, his missionary journey. Again, this is kind of complex. You can see that it starts out in Antioch. It goes all across Asia Minor. It goes up to in what we would call the modern nation of Greece, cities we're familiar with, Thessalonica, Berea. There's Athens. There's Corinth. It goes back into the area of Asia Minor to Ephesus, and then ultimately gets back on a ship, travels past Rhodes, and comes all the way down here to finish his journey from sea, and then in Caesarea, and then travels by land all the way back up to Antioch. So you can see that it's quite a journey, far more complex than his first missionary journey. He was pretty zealous and pretty excited about the calling that God had given him. All right, then Paul's third missionary journey is recorded between 52 and 57, and it's centered in the city of Ephesus, which later on became what we might call the home office in Asia Minor. Paul would do a lot of things from the city of Ephesus. Again, there may have been brethren there who owned homes, who welcomed him, who made him feel very loved, and may have helped him to feel like he had an office there or a home there. So he's spreading the gospel into the surrounding areas from the city of Ephesus, including cities such as the seven churches in Revelation. And those they're mentioned in Acts chapter 18, and of course, specifically the prophecy to them in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. So from Ephesus, Paul carried on an ongoing correspondence with the Corinthian church, for example, and possibly other churches. While in Corinth, at the end of this journey, he wrote the epistle to the Romans. So it was near the end or during this third missionary journeys that he writes a number of the epistles that are recorded in the New Testament from Ephesus, and also a few from Corinth itself. And while he's there serving those churches, he continues to write because that was a great way to reach other churches. The way it worked is you would write a letter, and the idea was is that letter would be circulated among the small Christian churches. So it would go to one church, they would read it on the Sabbath day along with scripture, readings from Paul and some teaching and instruction, and then someone would take it to another congregation and they would read Paul's letter, and they would go to another congregation. They would read the same letter. So it was a way of being more effective in getting your message across to a number of congregations by writing a letter. That's exactly why Paul wrote the epistles that he did. And again, the third missionary journey is as complex as the second. Leaves Antioch, crosses Asia Minor, again goes back into the modern nation of Greece and the areas of Philippi and Thessalonica and Corinth. He's in the region of Macedonia when he's there. And then he backtracks and he goes across back to Asia Minor and crosses the Mediterranean Sea and eventually ends up in Tyre and then continues on down to Jerusalem. So this is also a pretty complex ministerial travel or journey compared to his very first. This is Paul's third journey here on this map. And this again could be a sermon all by itself. And all these locations are taken from comments made in the book of Acts in the New Testament. That's how we know what was going on. So when Paul returned to Jerusalem for his last visit, and that's recorded in Acts chapter 21, he was soon arrested and imprisoned. First, he's in Jerusalem. And then, secondly, he's transferred to Caesarea. That's about 57 to 59. At first, the charges against him were that he brought a Gentile into a restricted area of the temple, which he had not, but that's what he was accused of. Later, he was accused of being a troublemaker or a traitor to Rome or a traitor to Roman law. The real reason for his arrest is clearly noted in the scripture. The crowd was enraged. In Acts chapter 22 is the story, and you could read it from verses 17 through 22. They are enraged when he mentions that God is calling Gentiles, particularly to the Pharisees and some who were very strict for the law. Gentiles were considered scum, and that was akin to heresy to say that God would be calling Gentiles into Judaism or into any way of life. So what happens is Paul was eventually transferred to Rome around 60, 61 as a prisoner of the emperor. And his story in the New Testament ends there. We have some books that he writes, and then there's just kind of an abrupt ending. There, is no way that from the Bible that you can put an absolute conclusion on when he dies. Tradition outside of the New Testament tells of Paul's execution in Rome, but there are also some traditions that he traveled to Spain or Britain before he died. Again, these are kind of murky. These are traditions because the Bible doesn't tell us beyond a certain point that Paul's in imprisonment in Rome, waiting for a trial. We don't know exactly how or when his end came about. And just the last thing today is just this little graph here in the survey of Paul. These are Paul's 13 epistles plus the book of Hebrews, 14, and it's just some approximate dates of when they were written and also from the locations, place of writing, and what the books are in the general period that Paul's writings were permanently written down and circulated around the churches and the congregations. So again, he died around 68 to 69 AD. We guess he would have been in his early to mid 60s when he died, which was actually a pretty good life in the world at that time, a world without antibiotics, a world in which there was a lot of violence, a lot of disease, a lot of illness. That actually was a pretty long life for the time that he lived.